Welcome to Conversations and Connections. Stuart Burson with you. We're the official podcast of the Family Crisis Center of East Texas, and I am the prevention coordinator for the agency. So dropping this episode a little early. This is going to be coming out on Friday the 19th. And the reason I wanted to drop it a little early is I wanted to do an episode about fatherhood. Father's Day coming up, I really wanted to talk about what does it mean to be a good dad in today's world. And so I thought about it, and I wanted to get one of my coworkers, Will Windham, onto the podcast. Will is our BIPP coordinator. He actually works with the perpetrators of domestic violence, and both him and I, both in our line of work, we always address the topic of gender roles. What does it mean to be a positive role model, or a positive male role model, I should say. And so I wanted to get Will on the podcast to talk about what it means to be a good dad. So this is going to be a very special episode. And, when I wrote this down, whenever I was saying this, when I said a very special episode, it reminds me, if you're old enough to remember the old sitcoms from the 80s and early 90s, every now and then they would tackle a very serious topic. And the promos would always say, a very special episode of whatever the show was. So it kind of made me think of that whenever I said that. But this is a very special episode because we do want to talk about healthy fatherhood and what does it mean to be a good dad. Here is my conversation with our very own Will Windham. Well, Will, I know you and I share office space, but this is the first time that you've actually been here to utilize the new podcast studio.
Yeah, it's awesome in here, man. I dig it.
and we're probably two coworkers of all of our coworkers. We probably see each other the most because we're kind of separated from everyone else, and so we pretty much see each other almost every day.
Yeah, and we get graced with the awesome podcast room over here, so folks don't get to see that quite as often. But yeah, we flying solo over here 90% of the time.
So, I wanted to do something special for Father's Day, and I thought about you just simply because you and I both kind of share a little bit of the same responsibilities, I guess, as far as going out into the public, talking about, amongst other things, healthy masculinity, positive gender roles, things like that. And then, of course, with you being part of the BIPP program, you're working with men, solely men,
yes,
all the time. And, I guess being a quote unquote a good dad, I guess it's kind of subjective. I mean, I guess with every person, it's their idea of being a good father is a little different, but some things I think we could probably all agree on.
Sure.
To a certain extent. Well, what would be your elevator pitch, I guess, is the best way I can describe it, that makes someone a good dad, or what does it mean to be a good father?
Yeah, I think across, our curriculum and really just the informal way that when we talk to men that we see when we do ask about, are you involved with your kids? Do you have kids? What's the status of that? Is our short speech is to show up, right? That's the biggest piece of parenting, the biggest piece of fatherhood. Of course, so much of this stuff is just really simple and intuitive. But I think that we know, and you could probably find research that spells it out a little better, but just showing up is probably the essence that's where the first step of being a good father starts, right? I think it's that simple.
When you say showing up, what is that?
I think, just being involved, right? I think being emotionally present, being involved, you're a physical presence. I think we hear so many people that say they grew up without a father, right? And without specifically asking, what do you mean by that? I think most of the time we understand that, single mom was filling both roles. We had a conversation with a BIPP, a guy who completed BIPP this last week, and he would tell us a story where, his mother was both the mother and the father. And while it's a really inspirational story to listen to him talk about the things he took away from his mother from that, what still is underscored by that is all the issues that come with having to take one parent fill both roles, right?
Right. And, when you mentioned showing up and being there, that song, I don't know if it's from the 60s or 70s, Cats in the Cradle.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up, because that's a song that pretty much sums up a dad, I guess, kind of paying the price for not being there with his son as his son is growing up. And I guess, the importance, one of the things I think about, and I guess I'm coming into this from a unique perspective, talking about fatherhood, not being a father myself, but one would think, I get, being a good father, it's more, it's having a good relationship with your kids. It's not just checking the boxes. Okay, well, I showed up to soccer practice. Check. I tucked the kid in bed. Check. It's actually talking with your kids. And I want to make sure that when we talk about this, I'm not just talking about, and we're just not talking about father-son relationship.
Sure.
We're talking about father-son, father-daughter, relationships with their child. But I think it's, how many dads just really have what they would call a relationship with their kid?
Yeah, it would be interesting to go out and just, you have to wonder, we do work with men around mostly relationships with intimate partners, but they all have children. Padres at ADAC deals with some of the parenting, and I think a lot of it just goes into this idea, what were men allowed to do as fathers previously? What are they allowed to do now? Like if a man previously wasn't allowed to stay home and be a caregiver, but now that door is sort of open to him, but doesn't necessarily have the skills to do that, right? So there's some learning that I think has to come behind that. But yeah, you have to be involved with your children. You're setting the example. I looked at some research, of course, before I came in here. We see these guys and hear their testimonies, and again, just to your point, don't have to be a biological father. You figure, you don't have to create biologically a kid to be a father, right? I mean, so for years, you can be a father figure to children, and it doesn't have to necessarily be your biological child. But these dads, they're setting the bar for these future relationships, without getting into what female and males see. But that father's really essentially setting that safety bar, and that matters in all future relationships, right? So if kids see dad creating a safe environment, they'll go on into the world trusting that these environments are safe. And you'll get that's a real healthy relationship marker. But if you create an unsafe environment, your kids grow up very untrusting. They don't know if mom's safe. They don't know if they're going to be safe tonight. And as they go on in their life, those situations tend to compound on themselves, right? So that's a lot of where fatherhood starts. I think that environment you create around trust, which again impacts all relationships you'll ever have, right?
Right. Well, and you're talking about creating a safe environment. What comes to my mind when you said that was kids observing how their parents get along, how their father treats their mother, right?
Yes.
And I think men have to be mindful of that how they're behaving in the house towards their spouse or significant other, I should say, that can play an impact. Their kid's going to pick up on that.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think we always say in the most unscientific way we can explain this is you're basically downloading a program till you're about 7 years old, and you don't really get a choice who your parents are. You don't get a choice how they treat each other. So that really boils down to the accountability on the parents, right? But kids definitely watch how, dad treats mom and how mom treats dad and how those relationships go. And again, back to that whole thing, if that's a safe situation, then it's much more, much healthier for the kid. But basically being unsafe all the time or worried as a kid, whether dad was going to come home intoxicated and the cops were going to show up, right? We hear these stories all the time. And of course, these things tend to lead to finding partners that are the same, right? Men tend to reflect the way their father is. They're going to mirror their father, and then research will tell you that women are going to go and look for the same safety level provided by their dad. So,
I guess, and that was one thing I was going to bring up. Is it a cliche? Is there truth to be said about daughters seeing how their father treats their mother? When that daughter gets old enough to start dating and to get into relationships, are they going to seek that same type of behavior? Are they going to normalize that? Well, that's the way my dad treated mom, so I guess this is okay. This is the way it is.
I think it's research would tell you that trends that way, and you'll seek the same level of safety that you're familiar with, right?
Yeah.
And so if that level is unhealthy when you were a child, probably not going to be all that uncommon to find that you're in that same level of unsafety in your current relationship, right? Mm-hmm. Just because that's all you knew. You grew up, you learned to exist, and you can manage those situations. For folks that say this, why don't women just leave those situations? We've heard all our life. Well, even for our advocates across town that are very much experts in this, we can't necessarily explain to a woman how she needs to leave a relationship because she's the expert of that, right? She's lived in that situation. She knows how to keep herself safe and get out. We provide encouragement, but we certainly don't have the answer for how she should leave.
Yeah. When you talk to your guys in BIPP, and if you're not familiar with BIPP, BIPP is the program here at the agency that works with perpetrators of domestic violence. When you talk to these guys, is it ever brought up how they saw their fathers treat their mothers?
We touch on that. We do some worksheets around, talk to us about how your dad was. And across the 24-week program in BIPP, those are going to be one of those moments where people are going to get quiet, right? When you're forced to reflect in that way, to think about your dad or your lack of a dad, and then to say, well, some of my bad behaviors may be part of this, we don't get a whole lot of feedback, but men will tell us, and again, back to another man that just finished recently, and we ask him, what do you think about the program? And he says, well, I feel like this filled the father role for me. Well, that's the first time I've heard someone say that, but it's not that far off because these are some of the lessons that you probably learned from your father, or we would expect that you were picking up some of these skills and tasks around, accountability, courage, communication, things that your father should be teaching you. Your mom, she grew up knowing these emotional sides. Like we often say women are better at the communication, the softer side, and dad should be the more confronting. But all of these things, they come from your father. You need to watch both your mother and your father do these things. Do
you think the roles of fathers have changed over the years? I know that's kind of a very broad question, but I guess, as times change, do responsibilities change, do you think, as far as the roles a man needs to do to fulfill that obligation of being a good dad?
I think maybe attitudes around it, change. But what father should be has probably been, pretty consistent across time, right? That provide the safety, provide the food and things. But again, back to that situation, the conversation about a few more doors have been opened for men. You're a little bit, you're allowed more socially acceptable to be that, house husband, as they like to say. And that's wonderful, but really, what skills then do we have? We were struggling with the skills, what it meant to be a father. So now you're going to be thrust into this role where you're going to be the caregiver all the time. You're just even more behind the curve. But I think these doors are open. We're okay with men being like, hey, look, I tote 3 kids around all the time. I've got the Volvo van out here and I'm taking care of these kids. Hey, we're going to, we build that up, we encourage that participation with your kids. We do ask men, hey, are you involved with your kids? And encourage that if it isn't currently happening. But
is it different being a dad if the child is in a 2-parent household versus a 1-parent? And I guess what I mean is when the dad is there every day, to help tuck the kids into bed versus and there's a lot of families out there that are single parent. And even if you are a responsible, loving dad and you have visitation where you get them every other weekend and every Wednesday, which seems to be kind of the normal, I guess, how does that affect a kid? I mean, obviously it does because the dad's not around every day.
Yeah, I think, from the perspective of the father, I think we tell men control what you can control, right? If you can only see that kid once a month, just show up the best you can. Then it goes into this idea that we very much touched on, which is glossed over so much. And I heard someone say, you can't truly respect your kids if you don't respect the kid's other parent, right? And I to a degree, believe that, this co-parenting idea, men are discouraged by this. They're really angry or raw at the other parent. Maybe they're the ones that called the cops. They tend to drift into this idea where they want to use the children against each other, which is just damaging all around. Mm-hmm. And, but I think as far as single parent households and fathers are, again, the first step we ask them is show up. It's the simplest thing you can do, right? It's not rocket science. You don't have to think more than that. When his T-ball game is, go. And don't make a scene, right? Show up for the kid. The focus becomes the kid. And we have to sort of flush all of that out because we're really angry at the other partner a lot of times. Yeah. But, I think for these guys, they're very beat down about the system. Again, they have negative attitudes a lot of times. They think that the system wants money from them, and we're associating kids with money. My partner's had all these kids. Now she wants all this child support. We get very negative messaging. The court got her back. I called the cops. They arrested me. So a lot of it breaks along these gender lines, and you start to see where very soon the guy can rope these children into being, he's being angry at the partner, so he's going to be angry at the children too, right? Or he doesn't. It's just easier for him to disappear from the scene than make the effort, right?
Yeah.
So
talking about a dad having visitation, and I think I have probably told you this story before, and I've told a few people, and this was several years ago. I was sitting down for dinner at Whataburger here in Lufkin, one of the Whataburgers here in Lufkin. And, of course, I don't know this for sure, but this just looked like I had a feeling this was the scenario. I saw a man and 2 teenage daughters. One may have been teenage, one may have been preteen, maybe young teens. And this was on a Wednesday. And I got the vibe that, hey, it was Wednesday night. He had his daughters. They were at Whataburger, and no one was talking. What were they doing? The girls were on their phone. He was sitting there eating. And, I just thought that is such a sad thing. If this was true, now, like I said, this is just speculation, but I just got strong vibes on this. This father only sees these girls probably once a week on Wednesdays, every other weekend, let's just say. And, on Wednesday, he has them for a few hours, and this is how they're spending their time. And I guess it goes back to my statement at the beginning, at the top of the show about having that relationship. Yes. Yeah. he was checking off the box. Okay, I got the kids. I'm going to take them to eat. But what kind of relationship were they having?
I think, when you trace fatherhood back to its very origin, anybody can create a kid, right? Anybody. Fatherhood isn't something that happens to you. You know what I mean? You have to be intentional. Anyone can create a kid. We can, we say that loosely, but for the most part, you don't have to decide to be a parent to have a kid show up on the scene. What you do after that is very much the things we teach in BIPP. Be intentional about it. What do you know about being a father? And ask yourself, what type of father are you? And then as soon as you're done with that conversation, ask yourself if that's the type of father you want to be. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so it's this willingness to be intentional about it. That situation you're explaining sounds like, hey, look, I've got to be a father. I've got to take these kids. I'm going to do the minimum. Right now, we would say you showed up for those kids. You picked them up. Congratulations. We are glad that you did that.
And kudos to him for doing that, because I'm sure there's a lot of men out there that, you know what, find an excuse. Yeah, I can't have the kids.
Yeah, but the value, your legacy, your children, these are the people that when you're older, who's going to show up to help you? You're going to leave your things to them, the things you've accumulated. These are the people that when you're older, you'll be turning to them for help, right? They're going to show up and help you. And I just hate those situations. As I get older, is like I meet people now and they're like, well, I just would never have anything to do with my parents. It'd be very hard to show up for them because the way they raised me is just a terrible way to think, is like you explain such a horrible childhood and then when your parents get older, they're going to wish, hey, maybe we should have treated our children a little better. And you don't want that to be your legacy, right? Yeah. You want to have a relationship with your children. And again, it matters to their relationships. Again, not just about you, right?
Right. Talking about relationships with your kids and seeing how a man treats their mother and things like that. Do you think it's built into a lot of men's DNA to have a hard time expressing affection, expressing love? This may be a cliche, but you see this a lot of times on TV, and I think I have known some men out there, they have a hard time saying I love you, maybe even to their spouse. And to their kids, they just have a hard time with that. Do you think that? Why do some men? Do you think? I
mean, again, we're back to those sort of gender dynamics where men sort of commit this emotional suicide at like 5 or 6 years old, and then that just continues on, and then it becomes. Some men really ingrain this idea of like if you show some compassion or love, it's weakness, and I think that some men really, I do know some men like that I'll watch the granddaughter tell the grandfather that they love him, and then they'll make a joke because he won't say it back. It's very much a joke, Yeah. And why can't that man say that back, right? So it's very interesting. You're right. Yeah, but I think it has to be this idea that, you're weak. Again, we watch in BIPP, we share a story. Tony Porter shares a story where, this gentleman's son has died and he was like a teenager and he holds back all these tears until all these women get out of the car. And then he finally burst out crying. And the other son is telling this at the same time his dad is crying. He's building this kid up for not crying. So very ingrained to not show this emotion.
Like, I'm proud of you for not crying.
Yeah. Right? I'm sorry. I'm so upset over here and you're better off than me because you're not, but, that's unhealthy.
Well, and that's going off maybe into a whole other topic we could have a show about sometime, about the gender roles. And when I talk to kids even about that, I'll ask them, okay, how many of you think it's okay for a man or a boy to cry? And a lot, and I will give credit, a lot of them will say, oh, it's okay, but there's always at least that few, no. Well, how come it's not okay? It just isn't. Yeah. They don't really have. And I'm sure they've seen or heard maybe their father saying something like that and whatnot. But they never really have a good reason.
Sure.
And I guess this goes into whenever I was preparing for our conversation and I was thinking about all the things we were wanting to talk about, and, we're talking about, men having a hard time expressing love, kind of going into that, and I will attest to this. My dad never talked to me about sex. He never sat me down to tell me how things operate, how things work. It was up to my mom. And of course, Mom was more than willing to sit down and talk with me. Well, what did I want to do? I wanted oh my God, Mom, I do not want to hear, I do not want to talk about this. Of course, I think I would have said the same thing to my dad. But looking back, he never said a word to me about what, and beyond sex, just about relationship with women, or anything like that. Yeah. We never had a conversation.
Yeah. I look at those scenarios in my life and I think of that, those stories about my dad. And I think in my personal opinion, he didn't know what he was doing either. He was winging it. He just was winging it too, and he never asked, I think, this education, men weren't allowed to ask. I mean, I think 10 or 20 years ago, you would be probably shamed for saying, well, I care about my relationship with my wife and I want to make it better, which wouldn't have been a popular thing to say. Still might not be a popular thing to say, Yeah. But again, it doesn't matter. But yes, back to a video I saw that just brings this point back. When a kid is born, has no inherent idea or programming on how to either be a boy or a girl, right? If it's biologically a female, that female has no idea how to be a female or a male in our society. It learns all of that, right? Gets pink or it gets blue, starts very early, learns what that means. We have a choice in the way we teach that, right? So that very much for men and males, what it means to be a male is a learned thing from jump. Mm-hmm. Right? What it means to me. Now, there are some biological things this isn't for that. That mean you're male, right? But for the most part, you learn to be a male through example. You watch, you learn those behaviors, right? We always talk about this behavior change. You can learn a behavior. You can unlearn a behavior. Being a male or being a man in this society is very much a learned thing. And a lot of times you didn't have a lot of choice, right? Up to about 7 or 8 years old. And then if you wanted to fit in, you still had to make these negative choices to just quote unquote be a man. Right? Yeah. And so we arrive here today. A lot of these men we see, they've lived under this sort of guise all these years, and you just have to remind them. And that's when we do BIPP in a group. It's okay to not live up to these things anymore, right? It's okay to be emotional. In fact, if you're going to survive in your relationship with your kids, if you're going to be a father, you're going to have to be emotional. You're going to have to access your emotions. You're going to have to learn to leave the anger behind, right? And learn what's really going on.
Yeah. What about kids who don't have fathers at all? The father is out of the picture. You don't even have a father who has visitation once a week. I guess this is twofold. First of all, what do you think a single mother can do to help fill that void? Is there something she can do?
No, great question. I probably looked around more on this one than any other one that we was prompted with. Yeah, very interesting, right? So if you don't have a father, what can a mother do? And of course, it's very interesting. Some of the things you reach out to extended family, find that positive role model. You can look at church. There are mentorship programs, of course, here in Lufkin and Nacogdoches. Good luck on that for young men. They might be out there. Please let us know if they are. But the biggest thing I found about those things was that longevity. The research shows that the longevity of the mentorship with the boys was the key, not the frequency, right? So if you spend 3 days a week with a young male for a month, that's wonderful. But then if you just leave that situation, it looks a lot like rejection. And that's where the struggles are already with these one-parent households, right? Because as a kid growing up, you start to begin, where's dad? Why isn't dad here? And then we internalize that as a kid, right? It must be my fault, right? Yeah. Must be my fault. Or we get angry at mom, right? So these things, growing up without this kid, without it being addressed, it's very damaging, and it looks a lot like rejection. Moms can find this, but again, we just went through a training where these predators of kids are everywhere. Be intentional. Do your work. If don't just find a man that says, I'm interested in mentoring your kid, let me have him over for the weekend. Don't do that, right? Vet these people. Find them find extended family. You don't have to be in an intimate partner relationship with a man to find that mentor, right? I think that gets confused sometimes. Like, I need a man for my kids, so I'll just tolerate this other man's bad behaviors towards me because he's a great dad. He loves the kids, right? Quote unquote, loves the kids. That's not going to work either. That's still unhealthy for your kids if you're involved in an unhealthy relationship,
Yeah.
But I think with that, if you're looking for, get that kid into some sports, maybe he doesn't like sports, we can find other groups with positive male influences. But again, you do have to vet that. And I just, from teaching BIPP and being around this, that's probably a tough task for women. Hey, look, ma'am, you need to take this man, your young boy, around a bunch of other men. And we just all know the dangers that come with that. Or what do men assume when a woman's asking you, hey, man, do you mind mentoring my kid, right? Don't confuse the care for the kid for the interest in a romantic relationship, right? Which is what happens so often here. But yeah, those are places, again, look at extended family, uncles, cousins, some males in your family maybe that are positive. Churches often do that, right? The Boy Scouts, Boys and Girls Club, things like that. But again, vet these places before you just drop your kid off, right?
Right. And I guess this goes along the same line. Also think about, what can men do? What if, someone like myself, I am not a father. But, I really want to make a difference. I want to influence a child, whether it be a boy or a girl. What could a guy do?
Well, you could get a job as a prevention coordinator at the Family Crisis Center and run a podcast, and you could go from there. But no, seriously, I think. Well, again, and we talk about this all the time, where are these mentorship programs, right? And where do you reach out to them? Who's running them? And again, they just they're not prevalent out here, right? There is an alliance of single fathers group or anything like that. There isn't or that we're aware of, right? There isn't a single mothers group that are, looking to men to mentor these kids. So where are kids getting dropped off that we see that don't have two-parent households, right? Boys and Girls Club, these places that we interact. And I think it's safe to say that one-parent household creates vulnerabilities. It's risky. It doesn't mean that it's the riskiest or things are going to happen, but that one-parent household, you're going to have to expose your kid to other people just because you need help in life, right? And who you do that with, it matters.
Yeah. I do want to share, and I told you about one of these websites the other day, but I want to share a couple of websites that I've discovered. If you're a dad out there, hey, man, I need some ideas. I need some assistance. There's a couple of websites I want to point out. One, and both of these, they're very similar. One is fatherhood.org. It's the National Fatherhood Initiative, and there's some resources there. And also there is fatherhood.gov, which is actually run by the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse. And both of these are good information that have resources that a person can use. And one thing I noticed, which was really neat with the fatherhood.gov, they had a thing where you could check, okay, what can I do with an infant? What can I do with a preschooler? What can I do with a teen? And you would check these, and it would give you all these ideas of activities and how you can be involved. And I just thought that was really good because, hey, it's like you said earlier, anybody can produce a child. But then it's like, okay, oh crap, now what?
Yeah.
And you may have good, and I'm not saying you don't care. I'm just saying, guys may have good intentions, but man, I need I need some help. What can I do? And I think with both of these websites, again, it's fatherhood.org and fatherhood.gov. I feel confident that they can help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we say this in the groups all the time, is that there's no formal education around these things. You went to grade school, you went to junior high, you likely went to high school, maybe you got some post-high school education. Nobody gave you a fatherhood class. There wasn't an option to enroll in it. There wasn't another set of fathers teaching these courses. There's no formal education for healthy relationships. There is no class to enroll in. If we do these things, we're doing a one-time shot for an hour. Right. And so men arrive here without the education. I think the sooner that men are just realizing that, producing a kid is a huge deal. And the only education I have about being a father is what I saw from my father, which hopefully it was great. Right? Yeah. It's a total roll of the dice. Or you're going to have to be intentional about figuring those things out.
Yeah.
Right? And again, I'll leave it. Those resources are wonderful. I found one video from PragerU called Our Fathers Necessary. And again, just watch that. It'll answer all your questions. Again, you could produce a kid and step away and wonder if fathers are even necessary. And it addresses it from that standpoint. And there you go. So if you ever thought you weren't needed or necessary after you biologically donated to creating a child, you can watch that video and I can answer all those questions.
Well, and you brought up a good point. There may be some resources out there like on YouTube. Hey, go on YouTube and look up healthy fatherhood, and see what comes up.
Yeah, and again, it's not about being Father of the Year in the eyes of other people who see you. It's about affecting your children's life, right? And again, these changes, they're very small. Again, I think one of the other resources I saw was the biggest thing they're pushing now is this idea of 21 minutes a day, 7 minutes of undivided attention in the morning, 7 minutes at lunchtime if you can give it, and 7 minutes before you go to bed. And that's enough, they're saying, to sort of drive home some of this healthy interaction with your kids. So it doesn't have to be a huge investment.
All right. Will, thanks a lot. I appreciate you donating your time. Will Windham with the Family Crisis Center of East Texas. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yes,
thanks.
Thank you.
All right. And if you believe you need the services of the Family Crisis Center, we do have our toll-free number. That's 1-800-828-7233. And also, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions about what we can do with the podcast or about any of the topics that we talk about, you can email us at conversations@fccet.com. Remember, be the voice, if not for you, for someone else.